Stop. Before you form an opinion, stop. Because the story you think you know about Meghan Markle's early years inside the royal family? It may not be the story that mattered. The photographs existed. Everyone saw them. A woman in cream tones standing beside centuries of tradition. A smile that filled front pages from London to Los Angeles. Ceremonies, carriages, crowds pressing against barriers just to catch a glimpse of something that felt, to millions of people, like a new beginning. The world watched. And in watching, the world may have missed everything. Because here is the question a growing number of commentators, institutional analysts, and cultural observers are now asking, quietly, carefully, and with a precision that distinguishes their work from ordinary royal gossip. What if the most significant story was never visible at all? Not in the photographs, not in the headlines, not in the televised moments that flooded screens and dominated conversations for years. What if it was operating underneath all of that? In the mechanisms, the structures, the unspoken protocols of an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years precisely because it knew how to absorb disruption without ever appearing to resist it. That is the question now. And it is not a small question. It is a question about power, about perception, about how institutions protect themselves, not through force, not through conspiracy, but through something far more sophisticated. Through systems so deeply embedded that even the people inside them cannot always see the walls. New commentary has emerged in recent months. Thoughtful commentary. Commentary that is not interested in who was right or who was wrong. Commentary that is asking something more uncomfortable. Were we all watching the wrong thing? There is a moment, a specific early moment, that more and more observers are now returning to. At the time, it registered as nothing. A brief exchange, posture, a decision so minor it barely warranted a sentence in any report. Years later, people cannot stop talking about it. Not because anything about that moment changed, because everything around it did. Context shifted. New voices entered the conversation. People who had spent careers studying institutional behavior, public symbolism, and the mechanics of power inside ancient hierarchies began applying their frameworks to what had unfolded. And what they found did not fit neatly into any of the narratives the public had already chosen. This is where the re-examination begins. Not in tabloids, not in palace statements, in the quieter, slower, more demanding work of understanding why certain stories take hold, and what those stories reveal about the societies that believe them. By the time this conversation reaches its end, you will not have a verdict. You will not have a villain. You will not walk away with the clean, satisfying conclusion that so many people have searched for and so few have honestly found. What you will have is something rarer. A set of questions precise enough to actually matter. And one early moment, one seemingly insignificant, barely noticed moment from those first months, that may, in the end, tell you more about power, perception, and the invisible architecture of institutions than any headline ever could. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single part of this conversation. Because what changed people's interpretation of those early years was not new evidence. It was something far more unsettling than that. The energy in the air that year was not ordinary enthusiasm. It was need. There is a difference between a crowd that celebrates and a crowd that requires a symbol. In 2018, when Meghan Markle stepped into the formal machinery of the British royal family, the crowds that gathered were not simply excited. They were searching. Millions of people in Britain, in America, across continents, projected something enormous onto a single woman walking through ancient doors. Hope. Proof. The feeling that an institution as old and as rigid as the British monarchy had finally, genuinely, decided to change. She carried herself with a composure that was itself a statement. The posture of someone who had spent years performing in front of cameras. But this was not performance in any ordinary sense. This was entry into something that had its own grammar, its own unwritten vocabulary, its own methods for communicating approval and disapproval through silences so refined that outsiders often could not hear them at all. The public watched the smiles, the handshakes, the balcony appearances. Journalists watched the hemlines and the hats. Protocol watchers, the people whose professional lives involve studying how institutions signal their interior positions through exterior gestures, watched something else entirely. They watched the timing, the spacing, the placement, and they noticed early that the visible enthusiasm of the public was not necessarily a mirror of anything happening inside. Every large institution carries two sets of rules. The visible ones, the ones printed in guidebooks, announced at press conferences, documented in official communications, and the invisible ones. The ones transmitted not through words but through repetition, assumption, timing, and the quiet, consistent correction of anyone who deviates from a pattern they may not even know exists. One longtime observer of royal protocol put it plainly in commentary published several years after that initial period. The institution was not hostile. It was not welcoming. It was absorptive. It had a process. And that process had never been designed for the kind of entry Meghan represented. Not because she was unwanted, because the process had never been built for speed. Royal institutions do not change the way startups change. They do not pivot. They do not issue memos. They adapt, but they adapt across generations, not across news cycles. And when the outside world demands transformation at a pace the institution is not engineered to deliver, something begins to fracture. Not visibly, not dramatically, quietly. In the gap between what the public expected to see happen and what an institution of that age and depth was structurally capable of delivering, that gap, invisible to almost everyone watching, a pressure was already building. An insider, speaking years later to a documentary crew and choosing words with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight they carried, offered this. The expectations coming in from outside were extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary, and there is always a collision when expectations arrive faster than systems can respond. Nobody used the word collision at the time. At the time, everyone used the word hope. But here is the question that the emerging commentary is now forcing into the open, the question that reframes everything that followed. What happens when two completely different cultures, one shaped by centuries of incremental tradition, one shaped by the accelerating demands of a globalized media moment, expect entirely different things from the same person? The answer was already beginning to form. Nobody was looking at it yet. There is a word people reach for when they try to explain what went wrong inside large, ancient institutions. The word is conspiracy. It is the wrong word. Conspiracies require intention. They require coordination. They require people in rooms deciding together to engineer a specific outcome. What actually shapes behavior inside institutions that have survived for centuries is something far more difficult to confront, because it has no villain, no meeting, no document anyone can point to and say, "There, that is where it was decided." What shapes behavior inside institutions this old is systems. Systems built long before anyone currently living entered them. Systems so normalized, so deeply embedded in daily routine, that the people operating within them often cannot see them functioning at all. They feel, to insiders, like common sense, like basic professionalism, like the obvious and natural way things are done. To an outsider, they can feel like walls. In the months following Meghan's formal entry into royal life, specific moments began attracting quiet scrutiny from a particular category of observer. Not entertainment journalists, not royal enthusiasts, but people who studied organizational behavior, power dynamics, and the mechanics of institutional preservation. What they noticed was not malice. What they noticed was pattern. Small decisions about timing attracted attention. Who spoke first in certain settings? Which events were designed to introduce and which were designed to observe? The calibration of independence extended to a new member versus the calibration withheld. The speed or the deliberate absence of speed with which certain resources, advisors, or structural supports were made available. None of these observations, taken alone, meant anything definitive. Taken together, they began to tell a story about a system doing what systems do, protecting its own coherence. Dr. Jennifer Garvey-Berger, a researcher who has spent decades studying how institutions respond to disruption, has described the phenomenon this way, not about the royal family specifically, but about the architecture of all large hierarchical organizations. The system is not trying to hurt you. The system is trying to continue. And continuation, for a system that old, looks identical to resistance from the outside. That distinction matters. It matters because the public conversation about Meghan's early years has almost universally framed the tension as a conflict between people, personalities clashing, individuals failing, choices made by specific human beings who could have chosen differently. The emerging commentary is suggesting something harder to accept. What if the conflict was never primarily between people? What if it was between a set of rapidly evolving public expectations, shaped by social media, by a global audience demanding visible representation, by a moment in history when institutions were being asked to justify their existence in real time, and a system that was not built to respond to any of those pressures on any of those timelines? What if the individuals involved were less the authors of what happened and more the sites where a much larger structural collision became visible? Several early decisions, choices that seemed minor at the time, are now being revisited through exactly this framework. The decisions themselves have not changed, but the analytical lens has sharpened considerably. And what it reveals, when you look closely, when you set aside the need for a villain or a hero and simply watch how the pattern operates, is something quieter than controversy, something more durable. Those early decisions, the ones that barely registered at the time, years later, they will be reinterpreted completely differently. By the end of the first year, something strange had happened. The same events, the same appearances, the same statements, the same photographs, were generating opposite conclusions in different rooms. In one room, evidence of a woman navigating impossible pressures with discipline and grace. In another room, evidence of someone unwilling to adapt to the requirements of an ancient institution. Same footage, same timeline, same publicly documented record. Two completely different stories. This is not a media failure. It is not the result of dishonest reporting or coordinated manipulation, though those elements have certainly existed in various forms at various times. What happened to the public narrative surrounding Meghan's early royal role is something more fundamental and more universal. Confirmation bias operating at scale. Psychologists define confirmation bias as the tendency of the human mind to seek, favor, and remember information that confirms beliefs already held, and to dismiss, minimize, or simply not register information that contradicts them. It is not a flaw in certain people. It is a feature of all human cognition. The mind is an efficiency machine. It does not process every piece of incoming information from scratch. It runs new data through existing frameworks and flags only what fits. The problem is not that people are irrational. The problem is that when confirmation bias operates across millions of people simultaneously, amplified by social media algorithms designed to serve content that confirms rather than challenges, the result is not one divided public. The result is two populations living inside what amount to entirely different factual realities. By early 2019, the commentators and media analysts who were tracking coverage patterns noted something measurable. The same event, reported through different publication ecosystems, produced coverage so divergent that readers in each system had no shared reference point for a conversation. This was not about Meghan alone. This was a stress test of how modern media environments process symbolic public figures. And Meghan, precisely because of what she represented to so many different groups for so many different reasons, had become one of the most acute tests of that fracture in recent memory. Then came the event everyone thought they understood. An appearance, a gesture, a statement made in what was described at the time as a routine setting. It was dissected immediately by commentators on both sides of the divide. Each side reached a conclusion that perfectly confirmed what it already believed. Neither side, it turned out, had the complete picture. Because the complete picture was not visible from outside. It was not visible to journalists. It was not visible to royal correspondents with decades of experience. It was not even entirely visible to some of the people closest to the situation. What the complete picture required was something that takes time, distance, and the emergence of voices willing to say, everything we thought we understood about this moment, we may need to revisit it. That is precisely what began to happen. Years after the event that everyone thought they fully understood, new commentary began to surface. Careful commentary. Commentary from observers who had spent the intervening years not revisiting the personalities but revisiting the structure, the institutional context within which every visible moment had actually occurred. And what they found when they brought that context to the evidence. Reopened questions everyone assumed were closed. The event that seemed fully explained, it was not what it appeared. History does not change. Interpretation changes constantly. This is the central insight driving the new wave of commentary that has emerged around Meghan's early royal role, and it is an insight that feels simple until you sit with it long enough to understand how radical it actually is. The facts of those first years are not in dispute. The dates exist. The public record exists. The appearances, the statements, the documented sequences of events. All of it is stable, catalogued, and available to anyone who wants to examine it. What changed was not the record. What changed was the framework that observers are bringing to the record. Beginning in 2022 and accelerating through 2023 and 2024, a distinct category of commentary began to appear, not in entertainment publications, not in royal gossip ecosystems, but in spaces that tend to analyze institutions, power, and the mechanics of public narrative. Cultural critics with academic backgrounds, organizational psychologists, historians of monarchy and institutional change. Their methodology was specific. Rather than asking who did what to whom, they asked a different question. What would we expect to see, based on documented patterns of institutional behavior, if a centuries-old hierarchical organization were encountering the precise set of pressures it encountered between 2018 and 2020? And then they compared that expected pattern against the public record. The match was striking, not because it exonerated anyone, not because it condemned anyone, but because it reframed the entire observable timeline as something other than a personal drama. It reframed it as a case study in institutional mechanics. Within this framework, moments that had previously been interpreted as personal choices began to look differently. Timelines that had been read as evidence of individual failures began to reveal the shapes of systemic pressures. Statements that had seemed to expose character began to sound like the predictable outputs of people caught inside forces larger than any individual decision. One particular moment, which had been treated at the time as a minor, logistical event, suddenly gained enormous significance under this new analytical light. It was an early decision about communication, about who speaks, through whom, under which circumstances, at what level of directness. At the time, it registered as a protocol adjustment, barely worth a paragraph in any coverage. Revisited through the lens of organizational behavior research, it looked less like a minor adjustment and more like an early signal, a quiet, almost invisible indicator of the structural friction that would become undeniable within 18 months. Read that again. An early communication decision, dismissed at the time as logistical, now reads as a signal of everything that was about to happen. But here is where the new commentary introduces its most unsettling question. Even if that signal was visible to analysts in retrospect, was it visible to anyone in real time? Was it being projected by the institution deliberately? Was it being misread by an outsider unfamiliar with the grammar? Or were both things true simultaneously? An institution communicating through its standard methods, and a new member encountering those methods without the interpretive vocabulary to decode them in real time? The emerging answer is yes, all of those things at once, which means the question is no longer, what happened? The question is, were people analyzing events or projecting expectations onto them? The answer may be the most important thing in this entire conversation. There is a burden that comes with becoming a symbol. It is not requested. It is not negotiated. It arrives often before the person who carries it fully understands what has been placed on their shoulders. Meghan Markle became a symbol at a scale and speed that is almost without modern precedent. Not simply a royal, not simply a celebrity, not simply a new member of an ancient institution. She became a projection screen for millions of people's hopes, fears, politics, identity, and grief about the state of the world. Black women in Britain and across the diaspora saw in her entry into the royal family something that had seemed, for generations, structurally impossible. A woman who looked like them, standing inside a space whose walls had, for a very long time, reflected only one kind of face. Progressive communities across multiple countries saw in her presence a signal that the most tradition-bound institutions in the world were capable of meaningful evolution. Conservative communities saw a potential threat to the very continuity that those institutions existed to embody. International observers saw a test case, perhaps the most visible test case in living memory, for whether Western establishment institutions could adapt to the demographic and cultural transformations already reshaping every other sector of public life. Every group looking at the same woman. Every group seeing an entirely different story. And here is what the emerging commentary has identified as the consequence of that dynamic. A consequence that is not Meghan's fault, is not the institution's fault, is not any individual's fault, but is nonetheless real and is nonetheless measurable. When a person becomes a symbol for this many competing narratives simultaneously, they lose something. They lose the right to be legible. Whatever they do becomes evidence. Evidence for whatever story the observer was already telling. A confident posture becomes either inspiring strength or inappropriate assertion, depending on the viewer. A tearful moment becomes either humanizing authenticity or calculated performance. A silence becomes either dignified restraint or suspicious concealment. The individual disappears. The symbol remains. And the symbol is no longer within anyone's control. Not the institutions, not the media's, not the person who is carrying it. Dr. Shoshana Zuboff, in work broadly concerned with how public figures become sites of projected meaning, describes this as a kind of narrative capture. The moment when the story about a person becomes so powerful that the actual person can no longer meaningfully correct it from within. The higher someone rises in public life, the less control they may have over how others define them. Read that again. The higher someone rises, the less control they have. This is the paradox at the center of the re-examination now underway. Meghan did not simply enter a family. She entered a symbolic ecosystem of extraordinary complexity, and everything she did, everything the institution did in response, everything that unfolded in the visible record, was immediately processed through frameworks she had no power to shape and the institution had no mechanism to manage. The turning point was approaching. Almost nobody recognized it in real time. If you have ever felt that people judged you before they knew your story, that the version of you they decided on had nothing to do with who you actually were, share that in the comments. Because what happens next is about exactly that. The pressure was not stabilizing. It was shifting. And the direction it shifted toward would change the terms of the entire conversation. There is a moment in the life of every public narrative when something crosses a threshold. Before that threshold, the story is a story. Something that can be corrected, revised, supplemented by new information. After that threshold, the story is a fact. Not a fact in any verifiable, documentable sense, but a fact in the only sense that, for large groups of people, ultimately matters. A shared conviction so widely held, so deeply embedded in how people understand events, that contradicting it begins to feel not like offering a different perspective but like denying reality. By 2019, just over a year into Meghan's formal royal role, multiple commentators now argue that the public narrative had crossed that threshold. On one side, a settled conviction that the institution had failed a woman who deserved better. That ancient prejudices had operated through modern deniability. That what the world had witnessed was a structure protecting itself through the sophisticated mechanism of appearing to do nothing at all. On the other side, an equally settled conviction that the institution had extended extraordinary accommodation, and that the disruption had originated not from systemic failure but from individual incompatibility, from someone who had misread or declined to accept the terms of the role they had chosen. These two narratives were not simply in conflict. They were in feedback loop. Each side's behavior, shaped by its narrative, generated evidence that the other side used to confirm its own. Statements made by those who felt failed by the institution were received by the other side as confirmation of the incompatibility narrative. Institutional silences, read by one side as cruelty, were read by the other as appropriate dignified restraint. The loop tightened, positions hardened. And here is what the most significant emerging commentary has documented about this phase. The phase that has been least examined and maybe most important. Neither side was entirely wrong. Both sides were operating with partial information, filtered through frameworks that made some evidence visible and other evidence invisible. Both sides were, in the precise psychological sense, right about what they could see. The problem was not dishonesty. The problem was that the mechanisms producing the situation, the structural, institutional, organizational mechanics, were not visible from either position. They required a third vantage point, and that vantage point was not available in real time. A key assumption, one that had structured the debate from the beginning, was beginning to unravel. The assumption was this: that the story was fundamentally about who was right. The emerging commentary is dismantling that assumption systematically. It is replacing it with a question that is harder to answer and ultimately more honest. What if neither side fully understood what they were inside? What if the institution was not executing a strategy, but was simply being what it had always been, which is to say, an organism engineered for continuity in a moment that was demanding speed? What if the disruption was not caused by any failure of character or intention, but by the encounter between a modern, globalized, media-saturated world and a system that had never been designed to metabolize any of those forces? What if both sides were responding to real pressures and misreading each other completely? The assumption is unraveling, and what is underneath it is not simpler. It is considerably more complex. And that complexity is exactly what the newest wave of commentary is finally willing to sit inside. Here is the reframe, the one that the most careful, most rigorous, most institutionally informed commentary has now arrived at, after years of examining the public record through frameworks built not on personality but on power. The central story of Meghan's early royal role was never about Meghan. Stop. Read that again. The central story was never about Meghan. It was not about character, not about choices, not about relationships or communications or any of the interpersonal dynamics that consumed headlines for years. The central story, the one operating beneath everything the public could see, was about two competing visions of what the British monarchy needed to become. One vision, continuity. The institution's survival, across more than 1,000 years, had depended on its ability to embody permanence, to signal, through every gesture and every protocol, that it existed above the turbulence of any particular historical moment, that it would outlast whatever pressures the present was exerting, that its power derived precisely from its refusal to be shaped by the urgent demands of any single era. The other vision, modernization, a growing constituency inside Britain and internationally, was arguing that institutions unable to visibly evolve with the societies they claimed to serve would lose the legitimacy on which their survival ultimately depended. That continuity without adaptation was not strength but brittleness. That the appearance of permanence in a world defined by rapid, visible change was becoming a liability. These were not new tensions. These were tensions that had been running through the British monarchy for decades. They had produced moments of visible friction before and would again, but the arrival of Meghan Markle, precisely because of what she symbolized to both sides of that internal debate, made the tension undeniable in a new way. She did not create the tension. She made